does the Bible say about spanking?
In this video, we're going to examine the rod passages in Proverbs.
The verses most often cited in the Bible to defend spanking. We'll take a look at an overview of Proverbs, the cultural background of the day, and examine key Hebrew words that unlock the meaning of these passages. Then, we'll take each of the 5 rod passages one at a time and interpret them together to find their true meaning.
By the end of this video, you'll have a deeper understanding of these often misinterpreted verses and be better equipped to make biblically informed decisions about how to discipline your children.
People often use Proverbs as a parenting manual, but that simply wasn't its intended purpose.
So, let's answer the question, why was Proverbs written, and who was the immediate audience it was written for? While you say that the intended audience for Proverbs was anyone looking to grow in wisdom, there are some clues throughout the book that indicate a more specific intended audience.
Young men among Israel's nobility who are transitioning to adulthood and are preparing to become leaders in society. Some evidence to suggest this is that they are assumed to have wealth and influence and are expected to use these for the causes of goodness and justice in the land. For example, Proverbs 18:5 says, "It is not good to be partial to the wicked or to deprive the righteous of justice."
It doesn't matter if you're partial to the wicked if you don't have any power. And you can't deprive the innocent of justice if you aren't a judge or a ruler of some kind. We also see some proverbs that offer advice on managing a relationship with the king.
For example, Proverbs 16:14 says, "A king's wrath is a messenger of death, and a wise man will appease it." Very few people deal directly with the king, so we can gather that the audience for Proverbs has a limited scope. Also, the ending and climax of the book is a description of the desirable wife, which would be very useful for a young man who's looking to get married. We can see that the Proverbs 31 woman is someone who possesses considerable wealth. This passage also forms a chiasm, a literary device common in Hebrew literature that emphasizes the central verse, which in Proverbs 31 is verse 23. And verse 23 actually describes the public reputation and the influence of the husband. So we can say that the immediate purpose of Proverbs was to give instruction to sons who would one day be leaders within Israel. The first section sets the scene for the whole book. Chapter 1 is the introduction. Chapters 2 through 7 answer the questions, what is wisdom and how do we receive instruction? Chapters 1 through 9 contain 10 speeches from a father to his son. The pattern that emerges is that those who listen to wisdom and fear the Lord and live accordingly will have a life of virtue, integrity, and generosity, which ultimately brings success and peace. The father also warns his son about how folly and evil lead to selfishness and pride, which ultimately bring ruin and shame. Understanding this pattern that is established in the introduction of the book gives us a framework from which to interpret and understand the individual proverbs that come later. Chapter 8 is a personification of true wisdom. The first section of Proverbs ends with and climaxes at chapter 9 as it depicts 2 women, woman folly and woman wisdom.
The father instructs his son that he will have to choose between woman folly, who is on one hill, and woman wisdom, who is on another. Hills back then were where you went to worship gods. They were the highest places, so they were considered as being as close as you could get to heaven. So choosing between 2 women on 2 different hills is symbolic of choosing between which god you will follow. The choice is, will you be a fool and chase after the gods of the world, or will you walk in wisdom and remain faithful to the Lord? This question is intended for the older sons who would have been mature enough to understand the warnings for the dangers that come with sexual temptation and sin. We must remember this is the context and backdrop for the rest of the book, and we shouldn't cut to individual proverbs without first understanding how the first 9 chapters inform those verses. We must remember that the key question of choosing between foolishness and wisdom is one of sexual overtones and choosing between women. This is not a choice that has anything to do with young children.
The next section, chapters 10 through 29, contain hundreds of ancient proverbs that address a variety of topics, including family, work, neighborhood, friendship, sex, marriage, money, anger, forgiveness, alcohol, and debt. All of these can be understood in light of the moral logic that was established in chapters 1 through 9. The basis for many of these proverbs is that when you make wise decisions, things will usually go well for you, And when you make foolish decisions, things will likely not go so well. An essential concept to grasp is that these are not absolute promises, but rather observations about how the world typically works. In this last section, we see two collections of poems. Chapter 30 contains the first collection of poems, which were written by Agur. He can be understood as a kind of model reader of Proverbs. He is humble enough to recognize he needs wisdom, and he is willing enough to submit to Scripture and let it guide and shape his life. The final chapter is written by King Lemuel, who is passing along wisdom that he learned from his mother. The second portion of this chapter is an acrostic poem about a woman of noble character who embodies wise decision-making in practical ways in her everyday life. To understand the kind of corporal punishment that is described in Proverbs, we must first understand one particular passage in Deuteronomy that describes when to use corporal punishment and the circumstances in which it was to take place. Deuteronomy 25, 1-3. If there is a dispute between men, and they come into court and the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with the number of stripes in proportion to his offense. 40 stripes may be given to him, but not more, lest if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother will be degraded in your sight. The picture we get from the Old Testament is that corporal punishment was administered to men who were found guilty of a crime after being tried by a judge in a legal setting, which would usually be at the city gates. Corporal punishment was a punishment for a crime to an adult man. It was never to be administered to young children or to females of any age. The parents did not act as judge, jury, and executioner. It was done only after due process in a legal setting. There is no scripture that requires or permits the use of corporal punishment on children. In our English translation of the Bible, some of the rod passages refer to children. In English, this word is non-specific, but in Hebrew, there is a word for 7 different stages of childhood, and each of these could translate to the English word child.
The catch-all word child does not show us the whole picture when discussing Hebrew texts, so we need to be aware of which phase of life is being referenced in order to fully understand what these verses mean.
3 of the 5 rod passages use na'ar, which refers to a younger man who is yet to be married. Na'ar literally translates to one who shakes free, which clues us into the idea that this is the stage of life where a man would become independent and not holding on so tightly to his parents. In Hebrew culture, boys were considered men once they reached puberty, which happens at approximately age 12, and they would usually be married by the time they were 17 or 18. So a na'ar would include unmarried males between the ages of 12 and 18. Because of this, translating the word na'ar as child is misleading and has caused a great deal of confusion for people trying to interpret the rod passages. 3 of the 5 rod passages use the Hebrew word ben, which means son, and does not refer to how old the son is. For example, your son could be an infant, or your son could be 30 years old, and it would still be appropriate to call him your son. And the same is true for the Hebrew word ben. Because na'ar refers to a specific age range and ben does not,
We should let the use of the word na'ar inform our understanding of the verses that use the word ben. After all, we know that all male teenagers are sons, but not all sons are male teenagers. Because of the meaning of these Hebrew words, we know that the rod passages are not referring to children in a non-specific way. They are referring to a specific phase of life, adolescence. Because of this, we cannot use the rod passages to justify corporal punishment for boys below the age of 12 or for girls of any age. So now that we understand the intended audience, purpose, scriptural context, and the meaning of some key Hebrew words, let's interpret each rod passage one verse at a time.
the first verse we'll look at is Proverbs 13:24. It says, "He who withholds his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently." Let's start by defining our terms. What does discipline mean? In our culture, for many people, it has come to mean punish, but that's not how the Hebrew word translated as discipline, musar, is used in the Bible. Let's take a look at a few verses that use the word musar. Proverbs 6:20 says, "My son, keep your father's commandment, and forsake not your mother's teaching." Proverbs 1:2 says, "To know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight. Proverbs 3:11 says, "My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, or be weary of his reproof." The Hebrew word musar is translated in 3 different verses as 3 different English words: commandment, instruction, and discipline. In other parts of the Bible, musar is translated as chastening, correction, reproof, warning, and lesson. The theme here is that musar is something you learn, and it is not necessarily a lesson that is learned through punishment or a beating. In Proverbs 13:24, we also see a literary feature that is common to Hebrew: the use of binary language. Hate and love are commonly used in the Bible to make a sharp contrast, and here they highlight the contrast between the right way and the wrong way to act, the wise way and the foolish way, the godly way and the godless way. This verse tells us it is right and godly and wise to correct and instruct your son, and it is wrong and foolish and godless to withhold the rod from your son. So what does it mean to withhold the rod from your son? As we saw in Deuteronomy 25:1-3, the rod was used as a punishment for criminals after being convicted in a court of law. We don't have reason to believe that this is talking about hitting young children with an implement, but on the contrary, as we've seen, the book of Proverbs as a whole is oriented towards young men and not toddlers, and that fits into the natural reading of this passage in light of Deuteronomy 25. Because the Hebrew word ben, translated as son, refers to sons of all ages, it makes sense to allow the context of the book as a whole and the context of how rods were used in Scripture to inform our interpretation of this verse. One way you could paraphrase this verse could be like this: "He who does not let his adult son be punished for his crimes hates him. He who loves his son diligently corrects and instructs him."
Next, let's look at Proverbs 22:15.
It says, "Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him." Here the word translated as child is na'ar, and as we have learned, na'ar refers to a young man between 12 and 18 years old. So I think it's fair to say that using the word child is misleading. In the Bible and throughout Proverbs, we see that foolishness means more than just being ignorant or an idiot. A fool is someone who is a practical atheist. Like we see in Psalm 14:1, the fool has said in his heart, "There is no God." And in Proverbs 1:7, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Fools ignore God and his teachings, and their denial of God manifests itself in a myriad of negative consequences that are highlighted by the book of Proverbs. For example, Proverbs 26:3, "A whip for the horse, a bridle for the donkey, and a rod for the back of fools." You wouldn't say that beating the back of a 5-year-old with a rod is an appropriate way to treat a child, or that his poor choices naturally lead to criminality and the punishment that comes with it. There are no 5-year-old criminals. So we know that the Bible isn't referring to children when it talks about fools, because children can't make those kinds of moral decisions yet. They don't deny God or ignore his teachings. They aren't old enough to even understand all of God's teachings, and what they know and understand is severely limited by their developmental capabilities and what their parents and teachers have taught them. Because a child is not responsible for having a brain that hasn't matured yet, and because they are not responsible for who their parents and teachers are and what they are taught, it is not appropriate to assign them to the category of fool. A word more fitting than foolish would be childish. Children disobeying their parents 2 or 3 or 4 times is one thing, but it's not the same as a teenager who is consistently defiant and rebellious. Fools suffer harm, come to ruin, and die for a lack of sense. These are not consequences that children suffer for acting childish or immature, and it is not appropriate to say that foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. This verse is also descriptive, not prescriptive. What this means is that this verse is making an observation about how the world usually works, rather than giving a command that we must follow. A prescriptive command would have looked something like this: "Folly is bound up in the heart of a young man, therefore drive it from him with the rod of discipline." But that's not what we see here. So we can't interpret this verse as a biblical mandate for us to do anything. It's just an observation that we can learn from. You could paraphrase it like this: young men have rebelliousness deep in their hearts, but punishment for their crimes will teach them a lesson. The next rod passage we'll look at is Proverbs 23:13 and 14. It says, "Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. If you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from Sheol." This passage also uses the word na'ar, so we know that translating it as child is misleading, and a better translation would be young man. So it should say, "Do not withhold discipline from a young man." Understanding that this verse is not talking about toddlers, but rather adult men, completely changes how we interpret it. It is saying that we should not withhold correction from young men, that you don't need to worry, his beating won't result in his death. But on the contrary, you will actually save his life, because if he continues down the path of foolishness, criminality, and godlessness, he will likely die. The next verse we'll look at is Proverbs 19:18. It says, "Discipline your son while there is hope, and do not desire his death." You may have noticed a pattern. From our Western modern-day perspective, it may appear on the surface like it is saying something like, "Punish your child and just don't try to kill him." But that's not what this verse means. It's saying to correct a delinquent teenage son while there's still a chance to prevent him from becoming a criminal, which will likely lead to his death, either from capital punishment for a crime, or for example, if he was assaulting someone and they killed him in self-defense. The next rod passage we'll look at is Proverbs 29:15. It says, "The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother." To understand this verse, we need to have an understanding of the role of shame in ancient Hebrew culture. Shame was a major mechanism through which the culture would punish those who failed to meet certain expectations. The parents of a delinquent or criminal adult child would have been shamed by their community. They would have had a significant claim to have their son punished for bringing that shame on them. Here are some other verses from Proverbs that describe how the foolishness of children brings shame to their parents. Proverbs 10:1. "A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother." Proverbs 17:21. "He who sires a fool gets himself sorrow, and the father of a fool has no joy." Proverbs 17:25. "A foolish son is a grief to his father and bitterness to her who bore him." Proverbs 19:13. "A foolish son is ruin to his father, and a wife's quarreling is a continual dripping of rain." So how can we interpret Proverbs 29:15? It means that delinquent adult sons will learn a lesson from being beaten with a rod.
The thing is, now that you've learned that the rod passages in Proverbs don't command, permit, or even describe spanking children, you still need to know how to discipline and correct your children without spanking. Believe it or not, I made a video on that exact topic, so watch that next to make sure you are using the most effective and productive approach.